Good afternoon and welcome to all of you here at IIEP in the 16th arrondissement of Paris and to our online audience. Today's seminar is the second in our 2018 series, and before I move on to talk about the theme of this year's, I just had a couple of announcements because there are materials in the back of the room that we think would interest you. There is a working paper from the Education, Research, and Foresight series at UNESCO, which is going to be quoted, so some copies are available on the table. And also an event next week. The permanent delegation of Argentina to UNESCO has organized a 2-day seminar called Success Stories. It's all about looking at today's educational challenges and what has been learned from countries all over the world about how to tackle them. The themes are wide-ranging, and you would be most welcome. It is open, and it will be in UNESCO Fontenoy in room 12, which is somewhere in the basement, somewhere in the bowels of Fontenoy. Again, 14th and 15th of March, and some of the programs are available in the back. So turning back to IIEP Strategic Debate. Let me say a few words about this year's theme, which is meeting SDG 4's learning objectives, looking beyond the obvious. The defining of the Education 2030 agenda engaged people all over the world in reflections on what had been accomplished with the Millennium Development Goals and the Education for All initiative. As a result, two key issues are prominent in the Education Sustainable Development Goal number 4, equity and learning. There's widespread recognition of the global learning crisis, with millions of children and youth without access to quality education and unable to perform basic skills in reading, writing, and math. In the 2018 IIEP Strategic Debate series, we're turning our attention to issues which are less clear, such as what do children need to learn, children and youth need to learn, and how can we foster all-inclusive quality education at all levels for a rapidly changing future. So in pursuit of SDG 4, we must look beyond the obvious, debate new ideas and strategies that will ultimately redefine learning while ensuring accessibility for all. So today, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Simon Marginson to explore with us whether higher education is a common good, and which serves the universal goal of SDG 4. We think it's very important to look at higher education in this series. The contributions of higher education are explicitly recognized in SDG 4 Target 4.3, which is ensure equal access for all women and men to affordable and quality TVET and tertiary education, including university, as well as in implementation target 4.4b, scholarships. The SDG 4 framework for action references the many benefits of higher education for the Education 2030 agenda. It calls for progress regarding existing international agreements in favor of higher education and recognizes that a well-established and well-regulated tertiary education system can improve access, equity, quality, and relevance. It can also reduce the dissonance between what is taught and what needs to be learned to ensure sustainable development and take advantage of technology, open educational resources, and distance education. Beyond SDG 4, higher education is implicated in several other sustainable development goals related to poverty, health and well-being, gender equality, governance, decent work and economic growth, responsible consumption and production, climate change, peace, justice, and strong institutions. So it's quite a few goals. All point to higher education's societal benefits. However, while major expansion of tertiary education has taken place, systems have also become intensely competitive and increasingly stratified, with the financial burden of the expansion shifting to families and students. Within this context, analytical definitions regarding the public good nature of tertiary education have not allowed us to clearly distinguish its multiple benefits. This strategic debate will present international trends in tertiary education and provide an opportunity to discuss whether the normative notion of tertiary education as a common good would be a more appropriate way to frame the discussion on both its benefits and how to share the cost. So before I introduce our speaker and discussant, let me encourage all of you physically present and online to follow us on Twitter. We're at IIEP-UNESCO, and please use the hashtag strategic debate. Thank you. So allow me now to introduce our esteemed speaker. Simon Marginson is Professor of International Higher Education at the University College London Institute of Education. He's also the Joint Editor-in-Chief of the journal Higher Education and a research leader in the UK and a Changing Europe program. Simon's the director of the Center for Global Higher Education, and he's worked at UCL Institute of Education since October 2013. Prior to that, he was professor of higher ed at University of Melbourne, professor of education at Monash University, and in 2014, he was in my country as the Clark Kerr Lecturer on Higher Education at the University of California, Berkeley, during which time he also received the Distinguished Research Award from the Association for Lifetime Fellow of the Society for Research into Higher Education in the UK. And he's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. Simon is one of the most cited scholar researchers in the world in the field of higher education studies. He integrates a range of social science disciplines in his work, primarily political economy and political philosophy, historical sociology, and social theory. He works primarily on globalization and higher education, international and comparative higher education, and higher education and social inequality. He's currently researching local and global public good contributions of higher education, as well as internationalization of higher education as a public good. He's published many journal articles and books. His two most recent books are The Dream is Over, The Crisis of Clark Kerr's California Idea of Higher Education, and Higher Education and the Common Good. We're very delighted to have him with us today.
That's
Yes.
the book.
Shameless promotion of the book. Right. It's also a pleasure to introduce my colleague who's serving as discussant. Michaela Martin leads the shaping of the strategic debate series, so she plays many roles. Michaela is a program specialist at IIEP in our research and development team, and over the past 20 years, she specialized in selected areas of higher education, policymaking, planning, and management. This has included looking at systems and institutional levels. Michaela led IIEP's research on internal and external quality assurance in higher education, which yielded numerous publications and is still yielding publications. Her work and publications have also covered indicator systems for higher education, the management of university enterprise partnerships, tertiary education in small states, and the management of higher education institutions. In addition to her research responsibilities, Michaela is involved in training activities related to higher education policy and planning. And she's in charge of a module on education sector diagnosis, another on organization and management of the education system. And she leads several distance course programs. The Institute as well depends on Michaela for her assistance in technical cooperation projects at the country level. So we're very pleased that Michaela is serving today as our discussant. So it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Simon, and I'll move over there so I can see all the slides. Is that okay?
Well, thank you very much, Suzanne, for that gracious and generous introduction. And thank you to Michaela, who invited me today and gave a very good paper in our own centre's seminar program last year. Let me say that as a UK-based person, it's a pleasure to be still in Europe. And may that border remain as open as possible. Some of us would like to ensure a quick and speedy termination of the Brexit process, and to consolidate our relationship with Europe on a better basis than in the past. We're working on it. I won't say any more about Brexit, which we talk about all the time in the UK, but I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have at the end of the presentation. I've been writing on public goods in higher education for about 10 years, but previously I worked on, in fact, I began my career working on problems of private and public schooling in the Australian school system when I worked for the National Teachers Union for almost a decade. And these problems in our polities are deep-seated issues. But I think that we've slowly begun to shift the tenor of the discussion away from the question of state versus non-state provision, which was the dominant issue for many of us earlier on, to the question of what benefits or what outcomes education institutions provide and how we understand those outcomes in terms of a public-private or common good notion. And that's the issue which I'll take up today. I mean, I think that and I'm going to focus really almost entirely on higher education, but some of what we'll discuss today I think will be relevant to questions related to technical and vocational education and to schooling as well. Schooling tends to be by its nature, I suppose, more state-centric than universities and colleges are, but the fundamental policy issues across education are similar. I think the essential problem is this. We're at a point in history where we have a good understanding of what higher education, what universities and colleges do to create benefits or advantages for individuals in a narrow sense. We know that it's an advantage to go to complete a university degree before you enter the labour market, all else being equal. That's an advantage. And we also know that that universities and colleges bring certain attributes to individuals above and beyond just the fact that they're more likely to get a job and more likely to get a career than they otherwise would be. Universities and colleges make people more confident. They make them better able to deal with government and bureaucracy and markets and financial management and so on. So we know quite a lot, and there's a good deal of research in all these areas about the individual benefits. But what's more shadowy and less clear, because it's less well researched, although it's arguably just as important, is the common or collective benefits that these institutions, these networks of institutions bring to national society and to the world as a whole. And increasingly, higher education and research plays a very significant role in relation to the world as a whole, for example, in dealing with the great challenges of our times, such as climate change, such as epidemic disease, problems of food and water availability, problems of rising water levels around vulnerable coastlines around the world, and migration issues and so on. I mean, all these issues are issues which we're increasingly calling on higher education institutions to address on our common behalf. But we don't really understand, we don't really have the tools in a policy sense to grasp the value of higher education beyond the benefits to individuals in a systematic way, which will enable us to know whether higher education institutions are optimising their broader role, whether we're financing it correctly or enough, whether it's reaching everyone and the benefits are reaching everyone and so on. So they're the issues which I'm going to tackle today. And what's, of course, muddied the water to some extent is the prevailing idea of our times, which is that you can turn all of the erstwhile public organisations, public administration, public services like health and education into business-like entities working in a market. And that idea has taken powerful hold in many policy circles, a tribute to the effectiveness of a certain kind of economics, I think, in organising itself intellectually, in creating a clear-cut, bounded, clear-cut worldview, and being able to translate that worldview into operational policy. But while it works very well in some sectors, it doesn't work particularly well in our sector. And there are all kinds of issues and problems that have arisen because governments in some countries have been trying to force education institutions into this sort of business-like market model. And that has made it harder for us to conceive and to operationalise ideas about the public or common benefit of higher education. But the stakes are high because when you look at what's happening around the world, what you see, and UNESCO has been talking about this really for quite a while, is this tremendous upsurge in demand for and supply of post-school education around the world. The rate at which the gross enrolment ratio is growing is about 1% a year, which doesn't sound a lot, but if you think 1% of a year comes to 10% in 10 years and 20% in 20 years, you can get some idea of the transformation. And certainly since the mid-1990s on the graph, you can see how the growth of enrolments just climbs away from the growth in economic capacity and, of course, well ahead of the rate of growth of population. We're seeing a situation around in most regions of the world where post-school education is taking a mainstream, qualitatively much larger role than it did in previous generations. And if you look at the world regions, you find this rapid growth of enrolment is occurring in all regions, or it has occurred in all regions since the early 90s, except in Central Asia, where the overall gross enrolment ratio seems stuck around about 25, 28%. But in all the other regions, Latin America and the Caribbean, in East Asia and the Pacific, you've seen tremendous growth. And in Western Europe, Eastern Europe and North America, we're in a situation where more than 3/4 of all young people are going to enter tertiary education. That's a phenomenal change. It's a tremendous change. So we really do need to know a lot more than we do know about the public and common benefits which this kind of educational participation is associated with. Let me say, because it needs to be said, that participation is not the same for everyone. The quality of participation varies enormously. In some cases, people are attending institutions and not learning. In other cases, they're nominally enrolled and not turning up. In other cases, they're enrolled, there is an institution, but it's not open most of the time. There are many problems in provision. And to some extent, that goes to the question of public good and common good. And we need a way of understanding public and common good in this sector, which enables us to address those problems of under-provision and unevenness in quality. Quality assurance is one set of mechanisms, but we need a set of principles against which we can judge our quality assurance as well. So tremendous growth in education. And, you know, what drives it? Well, I think that what really stands out to me is that the growth of education is occurring in all kinds of economies which are manufacturing heavy, economies which are services heavy. Providing modernisation and urbanisation is occurring, you can usually expect to find a rapid growth in upper secondary schooling and higher education. And I just think that shows us that it's not simply market or employment driven. It's not about skilled labour alone. It's not even about governments deciding to expand opportunity, although they will say that's what they're doing. And to some extent, that's true. It's really about popular demand. It's about people wanting higher education in much greater numbers than at any previous time. That people sense for themselves a benefit as individuals, as families, as students, as parents in the expansion of education, so that it's incumbent on us, I think, to think about what that means for the kind of society we're creating through a much more expanded education system. And so issues about the public good and the common good become important for that point of view as well. Because if we're going to have at the world level, and I think we will in a generation, majority participation in post-school education across all countries and all cultures taken together, then it's incumbent on us to know what kind of society that this is leading to, what kind of world we're creating through educational transformation, just as we ask ourselves what kind of world are we creating through industry, through modernisation, through urbanisation, and through ecological sustainability. So it's part of that big package of modern trends, if you like, and education, and we need to understand it much better than we do. There's a lot at stake. I mean, people who receive advanced levels of education are empowered in all kinds of ways compared to those who do not. We know that as well as better health outcomes, more political participation and confidence, more financial capability, that the OECD Adult Skills Survey tells us that people who are educated are much more capable with electronic means of communication. They're much more likely to say that they trust each other and so on. And they're much more positive about migration and cultural diversity in their own countries. More tolerant, more able to live with difference, more able to live in more complex modern society. So there's a lot at stake here. And the kind of education we create will go a long way into defining the kind of society we have in future. I'm not sure how well you can read this. It's a slide that I developed only a couple of days ago. It's going to be difficult to read, so I apologise for that. But what I've sought to show you here is that education, as well as creating individual benefits, creates collective benefits as well, which has been the main theme I've been talking about up to now, but also that this happens at the global level as well as at the national level. And particularly in higher education, there's an important dimension which is cross-border and about world systems. I mean, knowledge, scientific knowledge in particular, is essentially a world system, and this has been a post-internet phenomenon. I mean, the most knowledge is now accessed at the world level in English language scientific journals. Most innovations at the national level are occurring in relation to that world body of knowledge, not in relation to previous national discovery. The exception perhaps is the United States. I mean, given the size of its research system, still many US knowledge science developments are being sourced from inside the US. But even so, even the US is no longer the majority of the world scientific output, and the rest of the world's now a majority. And so increasingly, even in the United States, researchers are seeking to cooperate with others abroad. So we're seeing it. We've got a world knowledge system, and we've got a great deal of mobility between higher education institutions. I must say that this global dimension and this global set of public goods and common goods, and these global individual benefits too, are in many respects centred on a small number of higher education institutions. The top 5 or 10% of research universities are the major global players, but they do a great deal. I mean, one of the kind of paradoxes of the public good in higher education is that these same institutions that at a national level are often very elitist, are difficult to get into if you're from a poor background. I mean, there are exceptions to this in some countries. Let me say that some of the top universities are more accessible than this. But in most cases, the top universities tend to be overly subscribed by the upper middle class and undersubscribed by the rest of the population. But these same institutions, which you might say are not very equitable and not very public goodish in that sense at national level, create very substantial global benefits of a common good kind. Not driven by the economy, but driven by the cooperation in relation to world problems and the development of scientific and other forms of knowledge. So that whole global dimension is important. I'll come back to that in this presentation. Now, these are the questions which I'm wrestling with in this presentation. I mean, is public and private a useful way to think about this problem of getting to grips with the non-individual benefits of higher education? It's the way we've usually talked about this problem, public and private, but maybe it doesn't have all of the answers. Maybe there are some problems with it, as I'll develop in a moment. When we say public good or goods, what's good? How good is it? That suggests there's a question of values that we need to think about. There's a normative question, and policymakers, of course, are animated by those questions. So we need to think whether public good or goods is in itself as a notion, as a concept, as a way of thinking enough to get to grips with what's good, what's valuable, what's virtuous, if you like. And the third question, does the common good idea help us in addressing this issue? Now, at this point, I pay tribute to UNESCO and say the UNESCO's use of the idea of common good has helped me rethink my own approach to that question. Public and private, let's start with that. Well, the orthodox economic idea, powerful idea, was developed by the doyen of neoclassical economics in the post-war period, Paul Samuelson. Some of us are old enough to have used his textbook as our standard first-year reference in economics, very erudite. Now, Samuelson's argument was basically that the world could be divided into market activity and state activity. And that normally speaking, you put things in markets because exchange in a market is a form of freedom and it leads to all kinds of creative benefits, new ideas, social enrichment, economic and social enrichment. Markets are good things, but if you can't produce something in a market effectively, then the state needs to step in. And that was from there derives his idea of public and private. And essentially the gap that leaves is civil society in a way, neither market nor state. And it was Elinor Ostrom's the only woman who's won the Nobel Prize for Economics, very important contribution was to bring attention onto the fact that people cooperate outside the framework of states and markets freely to create common benefit. But Samuelson has been, essentially Samuelson rules still in economic policy circles. And Samuelson's argument is that public goods that can't be produced on markets, because markets won't be able to produce them profitably, have got two characteristics. They're non-rivalrous, meaning that they can be consumed by any number of people without being depleted, like knowledge. A mathematical theorem can be consumed by all of us repeatedly again and again without using it up. Or they're non-excludable, meaning you can't confine the benefits to individuals, such as street lighting, for example, something that everyone enjoys or no one enjoys. So non-excludable and non-rivalrous. Private goods were neither non-rivalrous nor non-excludable. Of course, that's fairly straightforward, isn't it? But there's a bunch of things which are rivalrous but non-excludable, or excludable but not non-rivalrous, and economics has spent quite a lot of time on those. But I won't take us there at this point, because that is a little bit of a detour from my main argument. The point is, though, that the public-private distinction, this searching for goods which are public goods, and if not, they should be in a market, has been the animating approach to public-private in economic policy. It's the really useful thing about this for me is that what Samuelson is saying is that there's a category of benefits or social outcomes which we value, which won't be necessarily produced effectively in markets and will require subsidy by government or philanthropy. That basic idea that there are some things we have to finance outside the market framework. There's a minimum level of public expenditure needed, in fact, in sectors like health and education to ensure that adequate services are provided to everyone. That basic idea is very, very useful, and we should hang on to that idea. What's more problematic is Samuelson's argument that this is a natural boundary, that there's some things that are naturally excludable or rivalrous or naturally non-excludable and non-rivalrous. We know now, I think, perhaps better than we did, that this is also a matter of design, that we can design an education system so that it operates like a public good in Samuelson's sense. We can design an education system that operates like a private good. You can't have a research system which isn't government financed, because the research won't happen. But in terms of so research is knowledge is a natural public good. It's about as close as you can get to a natural public good. There are certain qualifications to that, like knowledge at the point of creation can be turned into a temporary private good. But as soon as it's out there, it can be reproduced endlessly, as everyone knows, with pirate music and video and so on. Knowledge is a natural public good. But teaching is more ambiguous. You can organise teaching as a Samuelson private good, or you can organise it as a public good. If
places in universities are very scarce and difficult. If it's difficult to get in, highly competitive. If there's a price on them, if there's high fee price on them, there's a barrier. If they can be, you can operate that kind of teaching service as a market. You can operate it as if what we're producing is private goods. By attending a top-flight institution, which costs a lot to get into, you can gain an advantage over others. There's elements of both rivalry and exclusion at work here. But you can also organise education services as basic education through much of the world is organised, as a universal system, as an open system, where everyone gets much the same value from it, where there's no great advantage in one person can secure over another by having a particular place in a particular institution. So it can be organised either way. It's a policy choice. So public good by design or private good by design, that's an important notion to hang on to. Now, there's another way you can think about public and private, and that's what I would call the state-based or political definition, and this is the most common one outside economic policy circles. That's the idea that public is what the state does, what governments do. Public is, if you support public education, therefore you must support state control of education, perhaps state provision of education, and perhaps state funding of education. Although, in fact, you can have state control without full state funding or state provision. But the essential point here is that the dividing line is state versus non-state. And this is very different to the dividing line being market or non-market. Samuelson's idea says it's a market or it's not. If it's not, then probably the state, but maybe philanthropy. And the political idea, the political definition says it's state or non-state. And that's not quite the same thing. The popular way in which people have interpreted that has been public and private is public equals state and private equals market. But as I'm going to show you, it doesn't quite work out that way because it leaves out large slabs of what is actually done. And I'll show you that by putting together the two notions in a minute. I mean, they appear irreconcilable as two different definitions in common usage, both important. When we talk about public, we think about state, but then when an economist talks about public, they think about non-rivalrous and non-excludable and financing. They're both in common use and they appear different and they point you in different directions to some extent, but they also are both in some respects useful. And that's why I want to hang on to them both by creating a combined analytical framework, which I think takes away the ambiguity. What this does is, what I've done here is this. The axis down the middle is non-market versus market. The top half of the diagram is non-market production. The bottom half is market production. On the other axis, the horizontal axis, it's non-state versus state. So it's the political definition. To cut a long story short, the top left quadrant, what I call civil society, is run by neither market nor state. Now, neither the Samuelson distinction won't isolate that quadrant for you. And you need to, in fact, do what I've done here, bring both definitions into play to be able to identify that quadrant. And yet there's a lot of activity which is in civil society and in the home, which is educational or scholarship and research based. Enormous amount of it, and a lot of formal provision of education takes place in that quadrant. On the top right, I call it the social democracy. That's where it's non-market, it's state-dominated education. I call this the Nordic quadrant. This is where, you know, you've got universal system, you've got no price effects, you've got everyone provided with high-quality education at the best. Where it doesn't have a kind of commodity value. It's a sort of democratic socialism, if you like. It can be very good and it can be compatible with high levels of academic freedom and professional autonomy, but it can also be organised on the basis of tight control by the state, bureaucratic regime and so on. And you can see both types of upper right quadrant in the world today. But the point is that market forces are not playing a role here. This is pure public sector, and it's also pure state driven. So that's a quadrant which we can readily recognise as the state end of a state market dualism, if you like. The other end of the state market dualism is the bottom left quadrant, the market, the commercial market, the for-profit provision. And they're increasingly important in the world today. For-profit colleges growing up in both established and emerging systems, and in some countries playing a really major role in expansion of post-school education. Problems arise from that, and I'll talk about those a little bit as we go. But that's the pure market one. But a market state dichotomy will not give you the top left, and it will not give you the bottom right either. The bottom right is where a lot of the action is in the English-speaking countries at the moment. It's the education as a quasi-market, state-controlled markets, not entirely commercial in their nature, not only underpinned by the state, they often don't have full market pricing, but they have competition between institutions. They have hierarchies of value. They typically imagine education and research as in commodity form. I mean, voucher systems are a good example of this kind of education, but you see it to a lesser extent in the construction of the UK higher education system as a consumer market, with the student as a consumer, not as a co-producer of education. A construction which the student organisations generally don't like and generally resist, but which is beginning to take something of a hold in the popular mind. So, you know, you've got this, by creating a diagram which gives you a role for both the state, non-state distinction and the market, non-market distinction, you can see there are 4 different political economies here. And real life institutions and real life practices, to some extent, are in more than one at a time. I mean, most education systems touch on all 4 quadrants to some extent, but they tend to be more in one than the others. As I said, I think the Nordic systems can be understood as in the top right. The English-speaking, well, certainly the US, UK, in the bottom right. But there are elements, you know, from the other quadrants in both those systems. Pure commercialism, well, it's a factor rather than a dominant factor, yeah, but it's there. And you see this not only in for-profit schooling and colleges at tertiary level, but you see it also in the international student market in some countries as well, which is a full-fee commercial business. So, but don't forget top left quadrant, civil society, a lot of things happen in there, a lot of common goods, in fact, happen in there, as I'll argue in a minute. So that, I think, public, in this rather complicated way, I think we can make public-private into a useful analytical notion. What it doesn't do for us is provide us with a policy framework. This is fine for people like myself who analyse how education systems work. But for the policymaker, this doesn't provide sufficient normative guidance. What we've got is public goods of some kind or another being produced in 3 of those 4 quadrants. But the word public goods has different meanings in those different quadrants. In the case of the top left, it's the free civil activity of families, of communities, of people. In the case of the bottom right quadrant, it's quasi-market activity. Public means quasi-market activity. In the top right column, public means social democracy, state-controlled, large-scale, universal in form, and so on. So public has different meanings, and so the policymaker does not gain a set of words that they can take out into the political landscape here. So, and the problem is that I think that our notion of public is too ambiguous in many respects to give us just the kind of straightforward pathway for education provision that the policymaker needs. So we move to the idea of common goods. Now, common goods can be given a normative character in a way which public goods can't. And so they're potentially a useful framework for, or useful template for measuring actual existing education systems against and guiding us in the way we might try and develop educational provision and the democratic inclusion of populations in running education systems. I mean, public goods notion is not necessarily progressive in any social sense, not necessarily very, if you like, public in the sense of being inclusive or democratic. I mean, technically speaking, when Putin went into the Ukraine or Crimea, he was engaged in public good activity. I mean, it was essentially, it was state controlled, state financed, and it was non-marketing character. I mean, markets weren't going to be able to produce his military effort on a profitable basis. Let's hope we don't go there. That'd be even worse, wouldn't it? But you know, clearly this is, you know, what states do with non-market activity is not always necessarily inclusive, democratic, or even modernising or enabling. So public alone isn't enough as a word. It isn't enough, either sense of public. And as I said, in the case of the military aggressor, it's both senses of public that are in play there. So clearly we need to do something else. Now, what do we mean by common goods? Well, but the way I use it is essentially to celebrate the great historical achievements of the French Revolution, to say that the core principles of social organisation are still, because we haven't come up with anything better yet, liberty, equality and solidarity or fraternity. Fraternity is a kind of masculinist term, isn't it? At least in some languages. So I like solidarity. I think solidarity says a lot, actually. It also connects to the labour movement tradition as well. So let's stick to those principles as a starting point for understanding what common goods are. Equality we focus on, of course, all the time in education, but we should think about freedom as well. We should think about the way in which higher education, and like schooling, creates human agency, creates human capability in larger sense terms, in all kinds of ways. In the ways I talked about before, it gives people confidence, gives people the fluency and the ability to communicate with anyone they need to deal with. It gives them the capacity to learn what they need to know to make a pathway through life, and it gives them the confidence that life is their own project and one that they can make for themselves, and in doing so work with others and make a better society in that process. So we should think about freedom as an important part of this too, not just about equal rights and equality, but equal rights. That's really been, I mean, so central to us in education as our mission and our obligation to create opportunity for everyone, to ensure there's no discrimination in that process, and that everyone's included, and everyone's included on a good level in terms of high quality provision and so on. So, and solidarity, because these systems do more than create positional goods for individuals on an equal basis, and they do more than create freedom for individuals. They also create societies and social relations. They help to. There's an interesting article by Gert Biester, which has been much cited, about 2009, I think it was, where he said that there were three things that education does at all levels. It creates qualifications, that is, trains people and it educates them for professions, occupations, and also credentials them. It socialises them. It brings them into citizenship in a larger community, a sense of how society works, but also a sense of the mutuality and responsibility that is involved with being a citizen. And it also creates subjectification, not meaning domination or control, meaning in the sense of the human subject. It creates agency and personality and capacity at an individual level. And that's not a bad shorthand description of what education does. So we could, by saying education is a common good, we say that we want these functions of qualification and socialisation and subjectification to occur on a democratic basis, fully inclusive, and at the highest possible level for everyone, and that there's no limit to our obligation in education to keep getting better at that, to becoming more inclusive and to lifting the level of what people can do through education as students. So that's essentially, I think, the normative idea of common good, that it's seeing education as a common benefit that contributes to relational society, that makes society more tolerant, more equal, more solidaristic, without excluding the achievements of individuals, without holding people back in any way. It lifts the floor of achievement so the peaks go higher. Now, this is an important template to bring to bear on actual existing education systems and to think about how they are stratifying opportunity, making people compete for scarce opportunities, allocating opportunities to some families more often than others, how our education systems, in many respects, our real-life education systems, more in some countries than others, provide opportunities for people to invest privately in education at the expense of others, rather than working to the educational good of all. Education can be a positive sum good, or it can be a zero-sum good. It can be a public good in the economic sense, or a private good. It can be either. And by saying it's a common good, what we're saying, amongst other things, is that it should be a public good in Samuelson's sense. It should be a non-market good. It should be available to everyone, not made into a scarce individual property. But also we're saying more than that. We're saying that it needs to take solidaristic equality and freedom related forms. So I think the common good idea provides a better normative basis than public good for tackling the disharmonies that have been created by markets, in reining back the competitive urge of governments to set us all against each other in education, in asserting the need to educate everyone well rather than just some people well, or put that responsibility back onto individual families, knowing that those with the capacity to pay will get the best outcomes. But common good ideas not necessarily solely take us to the traditional idea of state or government-driven public. It doesn't necessarily require all the provision to be by governments. It doesn't even require all the financing to be by public funding sources. What I think it does require is that government is in there regulating it, making sure that education is working out in these solidaristic ways, making sure that the establishment of mixed forms of financing and a range of public and private provision occurs within a regulatory framework and where quality is high and access and participation and inclusion are high as well. A good example of the contrast, I mean, you can say the Nordic systems already in a state-driven way embody these values, probably more than any other, but look at Korea. You know, go to the other end of the Eurasia, look at Korea. Korea, very good education system now. Really, the country making great strides in many ways, but you know, really a very fine education system at all levels. Wonderful PISA results and great universities and great research, going really, really well. And this was one of the poorest countries in the world in 1960, and now it's a phenomenal country. And education's been central to that. But you look at the education system, and at first glance, it's not a traditional public sector-driven form of high quality outcome like the Nordic countries have. It's a majority private post-school system. Even some of the research universities are private. Some of the very good ones are private. But 3/4 of students are enrolled in private colleges or universities, with only the top group, the highest selected group, going into the state university sector, where most of the research has been concentrated. And yet, what you find is that the standard of Korean private institutions is not like, say, India, which has a huge long tail of private sector institutions of poor quality, and which is one of the great problems that we've all got at the moment in relation to worldwide education, is the quality of the Indian private sector, which is holding everything back in India quite substantially. In Korea, this great long group of private institutions is regulated for quality, The state is in there. It ensures that these are good institutions which provide professional standards of instruction and learning, where teachers are properly trained and where the outcomes are good, and where completion rates are high and graduate outcomes are adequate. So, you know, you have effectively like a second public sector, but with some more autonomy and freedoms than the main public sector has. And of course, the Korean private sector complains. He would like to have the same freedom as a private company in the retail sector, but it's in the national interest that it continues to be managed in this way. So this is a good example, I suppose, of education for the common good, not being necessarily public, but with the state still being a factor in the mix, in the common good mix, which begins to suggest, I think, we have a solution to our questions. We have this combination of common and public as in terms of state. There are two complications that I want to throw up, because these are the things that bother me, because they don't neatly fit with the argument I've made up to now, or with arguments that others have made. One is that our understandings of commonness and publicness vary quite significantly in different parts of the world. The tradition that we all work on, because it's been dominant historically, is Anglo-American and Western European. And France has played a big part in shaping our thinking, along with the United States, Great Britain, and so on. But when you go to the other end of Eurasia, back to Korea, back to China, back to Japan, Taiwan, what you find there is a very different tradition, which in many respects is pretty successful, and perhaps the strongest educational tradition in the world, as is shown by these wonderful PISA results which these systems generate. All of them, Singapore is another, Hong Kong, Macau, SAR, they all get wonderful PISA scores because they've got superb educational culture in the home, and which is reinforced and maintained by the school. So you've got very different tradition there, with mixed funding being the norm rather than state funding, with families investing heavily. Pretty hierarchical systems too, I'd have to say, stratified more than they should be in my view. But what happens is that the lower tier institutions, and this is where they're different to North America or Europe, the lower tier institutions are very strong in relative terms in most cases. So you have quite a different approach, comprehensive role of the state, a bigger educational role for the family, and so on. Perhaps stronger teaching cultures than most of those. Finland is another country which has very strong teaching cultures. So, different traditions and different ideas of what the role of the state and the public is. And Latin America has its own approach to these issues. The Latin American public university is a different kind of university to this research science university of the European or American kind. I mean, it's much more inclusive, plays a much larger public role in its societies, and in many respects is a place where the state itself is prepared and trained. So a different history and a different concept of the role of the state and the notion of public or common in education. So we need to get to grips with these important continuing traditions, which all have their strengths, let me say, not just, and strengths, they're not undue variations from the dominant or best idea. They're actually heterogeneous, distinct pathways which work in their own terms. And I do believe that it's going to be necessary in the end for those of us who are attempting to devise a notion of commonness in education at a world level to get to grips with the heterogeneity of these traditions and to start to put them together in terms of their strengths. Perhaps there are things which East Asia does which the Western state tradition doesn't do, for example. I mean, I think that East Asia is more likely to be able to tackle climate change, has the toolbox politically to bring the population with it, and would not be at the behest, at the beck and call of the oil companies and so on in trying to address problems of fossil fuel use and so on. Whereas it's very difficult for the democracies in the US and elsewhere to tackle the energy companies, to put them out of the picture politically, to the extent that they need to be put out of the picture to be able to take us forward, or at least to transform those industries, not to abolish them, but to transform them into something that's sustainable and works. So the Chinese, the Japanese, Koreans are more likely, because of the nature of their approach to the state and the relationship between the state and the population, to tackle those issues. So, and education will be an important part of that process, you can be sure. So, on the other hand, I think there are things which the Western traditions can do, which these Asian traditions can't. I mean, this extraordinary capacity for entrepreneurship and creativity in business and in intellectual life in the United States. For all the problems of the United States, it throws up so many creative people. And there's something there which is, you know, very important. And again, education plays a role in that. So it's not a coincidence that many other countries, although American education doesn't have good PISA scores, many countries are looking at what the best of American education can do and attempting to learn from that. So there are things to learn from each other. And I think commonness involves not just a single idea, but it probably involves embracing this diversity and establishing ways of working with it. But that also raises questions about what happens between countries, global public good. UNDP, another United Nations branch, as is UNESCO, developed very interesting set of work around the end of the 1990s around the notion of global public goods. And that essentially came out of the ecological or sustainability concern. And the questions of how do you start to allocate costs between countries in relation to cross-border effects. If there's a downstream pollution because someone puts something into the Mekong and it flows to another 6 countries, you know, how do you allocate costs? How do you create a system of incentives which moderates behaviour and makes all the countries become good global citizens? So questions of global public good are very interesting questions, and they arise in education and research quite a lot. And in higher education, they rise particularly because there's a range of ways in which higher education is, as I said before, involved globally. I mean, most research and knowledge in the sciences and in some of the non-sciences, some of the time, is global or international in character. There's an enormous amount of mobility in this sector. Lots of the leading people are moving between countries. Lots of the best researchers are cross-country in their orientation. They're working with each other across borders and they're moving between different countries for jobs. And that's normal business. So mobility is an important value in this sector. There's also student mobility, which is 6 million people a year and very significant in terms of the effects it has long-term in ensuring that we all know each other better, that we understand other cultures, that we learn other languages, and that we mix and match our ideas in the way I was just talking about a moment ago. So, you know, the cross-border and global aspects of public good are important. And because we tend to think in national policy terms, we think about national public good or national common goods, we don't think enough about what's common between countries and also what happens in cross-border movement and at global system level in systems like knowledge and communications and mobility. So that's the second complication. Global public goods which are neglected, which aren't talked about, which aren't costed, need to be brought to the front, and along with national public goods. And those things together, the questions of global public and common goods and the question of, you know, diversity between countries, sort of bring us to the point where we can say that there are some common goods which we might make or see as common to all countries, and there are others which we might see as diverse and varying by country, by culture, by region, and so on. And so the question then becomes, and I'm sure this is a question which concerns UNESCO on a constant basis, what is there? What general principles can we put forward in the world? And I think we need to be wary of the fact in education and training and research and in all other sectors too, that most propositions for global principles have usually come from one or another culture. They're national in origin. And I think in a more interpenetrated world, and the European project begins to do this, we need to put together these different traditions more than we do and draw on the strengths of each in the way I was talking about before. So we need to think about principles in this sector and others that will take in the traditions of more than one country, that will take in the major traditions. So what are global common goods? Well, I would think that in this sector, protocols on communications, on open communication, on and free movement, mobility between countries and between national systems of education and between individual institutions, and the rights of people in those processes. Because when people move across borders, they leave their country of citizenship, they're no longer supported by their own country in the same way. They are vulnerable in a new way. And those mobile people need to have their rights safeguarded better than we currently safeguard them at the moment, where we just treat them as guests, if you like. And guest is not a right. Guest is a privilege. When you go across borders, you should have more protection than just guest favour from the country you go to. Research and knowledge, free inquiry, academic freedom, I think potentially are common global goods in the higher education sector. And here we, I suppose, see how complicated this problem is, because traditions of academic freedom have different meanings in the great state universities in the Cordoba tradition in Latin America. They mean one thing. In the United States, with its tenure protocol, they mean another thing. In China, where freedom is understood as a positive freedom rather than as negative freedom, that is, it's understood in terms of your role as a respected leader of the community and the power that brings and the authority that brings you, rather than freedom from constraint, freedom from interference, which is our Anglo-American tradition of freedom. So even academic freedom is not going to be a simple matter to try to make into a global protocol, but we may be able to establish some minimum agreement here. I don't think anyone wants to be interfered with by government and told what to do anywhere. That's a common principle. And I think also that having the opportunity to communicate and to project your views in an open way is another principle on which people could agree. So let me move to closing, and so we can bring Michaela into this conversation. I think both notions of public, the state and non-state distinction, and the market, non-market distinction, the economic distinction, Samuelson's distinction, have some use and relevance to us in understanding how things work. And together they provide a framework for understanding the political economy of education systems. I have no doubt that quadrant diagram, which I've been looking at for 2 years, it works. I haven't found a flaw in it yet. And I think it's a useful approach. It seems to cover every aspect of educational behaviour, but it does not provide a framework for policy. It does not provide a normative framework, doesn't provide a simple, clear-cut principle. It's really a complicated social science explanation, but it's a useful one. Now, economic public good idea has a very important principle which we should hang on to, as I said earlier. It says there are some things which markets cannot produce profitably and states must finance or they won't happen. That's a very important basic principle which provides a starting point in an emerging country, in a developing country, for establishing the bedrock of a public education approach, is to establish the things which the state must support for the whole operation to be viable. Above that, it might be more arguable what the state should do, and it is partly a matter of resources and other demands on the state. But the bottom line is that this floor of public goods must be financed, must be perhaps its provision must be guaranteed, not necessarily by the provision by the state, but it must be guaranteed by the state if it's going to happen. So this floor notion of public good economic public good is useful. Common goods are the concept we need to develop, expand, work with. That's where we can put into the equation the type of society we want, and to attempt to establish principles which work across borders as well as within single countries in relation to education systems. However, we shouldn't forget that these ideas are specific to political and educational and social culture, that you can't simply impose one template without working through that problem, that issue in the place that you're in. Some principles are going to export much more easily than others. Some things require recognition of diversity in ways others don't. Global public goods need more attention. So in summary, I'd say higher education is a common good, and it's also a state sector regulated public good. That is, the public or government aspect is necessary to ensure that the common good aspect is working out. It doesn't mean that the state does everything, quite the contrary. But the state there's no substitute, there's no other point at which the whole society and its welfare and value is considered except the state. Civil organisation at its best is better than the state, but much of the time it's worse, e.g. contemporary populism. So we can't rely on civil organisation alone. I think the great strength of the United States is its wonderful civil society. That's what we all should have. But to rely too much on the civil society and insufficiently on the state is, in my view, is an error in this area. So the European tradition of the state seems to me stronger in that regard than my own tradition. So common good plus state public good. But the common good's the starting point, not the state. Common good's the starting point. So higher education shouldn't be always provided and financed by states, and that's not a practical idea anyway. We can't put the genie back in the bottle on that, but anyway, it's not financially possible to do that in all countries at all times. We do need private money in education, and we need private families and private sponsorship as part of the mix. But the important point about having the state there is that the state regulates and guarantees that that doesn't allow provision to be distorted, to be stratified, to be closed to certain groups and so on. The basic goods that should be included in the common good mix include the core principles about human rights, freedoms, equality and solidarity. And research and scholarship must be seen, I think, as public and common matters, must be guaranteed, must be free, or our knowledge and our capacity to understand each other's diverse knowledges will be impoverished. So it seems to me that's one of the areas where the state approach becomes instrumental and crucial. So not the only area, equity is another, and the guarantee of inclusion of all parts of the population, all ethnic groups, all gender, all sexual preference, disabled people, everyone, that we need the state and we need a Charter of Rights to guarantee that kind of inclusion. So again, to reiterate and to summarise, the main point is that I want to make today is common good plus state public good. And I refer you to Rita Locachilli's excellent paper published by UNESCO last month on this topic, where I thought that she set out the argument for exactly that conclusion very well and reviewed the literature far better than I've been able to do today. Thank you very much. I'll get rid of that. So
Yes. Should I continue?
Yes, please.
Okay. So thank you, Simon, for a very interesting presentation, a very conceptual presentation. And I think my task is to make a number of points on some of the issues that you have put on the table, and perhaps to push some of the ideas a little bit further. So what I would want to say in the first place is that it is true we have a blurring of boundaries between the public and the private, but I think I would argue that the private is gaining ground. So indeed, higher education, in higher education, it relates to different issues. There is administrative affiliation and ownership, funding, and of course the very purpose of higher education. And I think you have very much talked about that, and that also private providers can be quite in tune with the public purpose of higher education. So it's not necessarily a matter of funding, but what we can see also worldwide is that the number of enrollments in private higher education is expanding very rapidly. At this point in time, we have about 1/3 of all enrollment in private institutions. It has never been as high as that. And another trend that we can see also in the governance of higher education is the use of market instruments actually to steer higher education, such as performance funding or tenders, public tenders, competitive bidding, and the like. And so we are facing a kind of creeping in of the private in different domains and funding, in the use of public policy instruments for regulation. And I think you have pointed out very strongly the importance of regulation of the private sector, and I would definitely agree with you. Really the underlying question, and I think you have mentioned it, and the underlying question, the important question is really who should fund higher education? And if we address this question, who should fund higher education, we have to ask the question also, who benefits from higher education? So, and here we can take some reference, I think, to Education 2030 agenda, which, by the way, also strongly alludes to higher education as a public good. And it says, in addition to imparting job skills, tertiary education and universities play a vital role in stimulating critical and creative thinking. That's what you have pointed out. Generating and disseminating knowledge for social, cultural, ecological, and economic development. Tertiary education is critical for the education of future scientists, experts, and leaders. And through their research function, which you have also underlined, higher education institutions play a fundamental role in creating knowledge, and they underpin the development of analytical and creative capacities that enable solutions to be found for local and global problems in all fields of sustainable development. So I think here we have a clear acknowledgement in the Education 2030 agenda of higher education being a global public good. But we also face the difficulties of measuring the benefits, because should not forget who benefits should also contribute. At least it can provide a rationale of who should actually bear the cost of higher education. And it's a complex question. I think you have pointed it out, because we have the individual benefits, they are well documented in research. We have the collective benefits, they are less well documented. And we have economic, social, and educational benefits. So we can produce wonderful matrices with all these benefits at different levels. And we have underlying theories. We have the human capital theory that says, well, it looks for a linkage between higher education participation and economic development, and it's still used as a policy narrative today. So we say, okay, higher education leads to skill development, and so as a consequence, it has collective economic benefits. But then we have also an opposing approach, the screening theory. The screening theory says that yes, higher education provides high rates of economic benefits, but these are not necessarily due to workers' enhanced productivity from higher education, but rather because higher education credentials simply provides access to better paid jobs. So let's say in the theories, we do not have agreement. And with a growing share of young people going on to higher education, research has also shown that the private rates of return tend to diminish over time. So they also depend on many other variables, such as a graduate social status, existing networks, wherever you are located, you can have access to different labor markets and be more or less remunerated. So clearly there is no linear relationship between having a higher education credential and the wage premium that it provides. And then from the social point of view, we also know that an educated person generates significant uncompensated benefits. I think you have alluded to them very well. So educated parents bring benefits to their children, to their neighborhoods and communities. The greater the demonstrated magnitude of these uncompensated community spillover effects, as they are called in the literature, the stronger the argument for the community to support the cost of higher education. But while these benefits are intuitively obvious, they remain difficult to measure. And finally, it can be argued that putting economic and social advancements as the main purpose of higher education is also somewhat short-sighted. There are also many other educational reasons why young people want to go on to higher education. Only yesterday, there was an article in World University News, or University World News, pointed to research in South Africa among 73 young graduates. And the research showed that higher education graduates valued their experience in higher education, particularly as one that provided access to interesting knowledge, to critical thinking and questioning, and to intellectual challenges. Higher education graduates therefore have intrinsic and passionate motivations for higher education beyond the economic and the social ones. So as a consequence, the resolution of any debate over a measurable magnitude and relevance of higher education that would allow to provide an argument for cost sharing or the determination of how cost is to be shared, things depend vitally on public perceptions. And these perceptions, I think, I agree with you, they relate to cultural backgrounds and what is seen as legitimate in a particular background. If the perception is that the community as a whole benefits from higher education, then it will be politically advantaged to continue subsidizing tuition and higher education. So what are then the consequences for higher education policy? I would agree with you, Simon, that we definitely need a normative approach to the issue and of who should fund higher education. And if this normative approach to higher education as a common good values social solidarity and social cohesion in increasingly unequal societies, this in itself does provide the basis for a strong public investment in higher education. And we can then also take a look at the Education 2030 agenda and Sustainable Development Target 4.3, which establishes the normative target that countries should provide equal access for all women and men to affordable and quality TVET and higher education, including the university. And in Policy Paper 30, prepared by IIEP, together with the Global Education Monitoring Report team, we have argued for concentration of public financial aid to disadvantaged student groups. And we have also argued for low tuition and fees combined with income-based loans to cap student repayment burdens at less than 15% a month. And we have also argued for affirmative action policies for admission in countries where there are entrenched disadvantages for certain groups in accessing higher education and where there's a trend towards the stratification of the higher education system. And I think we are converging here on the main points. To sum up, yes, it is very important to accept that higher education has multiple benefits to individuals and society. And yes, it is indeed a common good for individuals, community, society, and the international community at large. And higher education needs to be backed with funding and admission policies that support the public good principle of higher education. And I think enough to put forward to the discussion.
Yes,
thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michaela. I would like to give the speaker an opportunity because Michaela's points as a discussant were many, and I think they deserve some thinking, and I'm sure you want to hear Simon's response to many of these issues.
Thanks, Suzanne. Yes, thanks, Michaela. I thought that was very useful, and I do agree with what you've said. One thing that particularly resonated with me was where you said that it's economic, and we emphasize economic and social benefits of kind of aggregate social benefits of higher education alone. That's short-sighted, that we need to acknowledge that individuals gain
enormous intrinsic benefits from this. And I think that's right. And I think that's part of the, if you like, the obligations and the rights of citizenship. And that's what also makes the better society. It's what it does to individuals. That's they together, especially if they're formed in relational ways, as well as in terms of their internal self-formation. You know, that makes a better society anyway. But I think what that point suggests is that, as well as rethinking the public and common problem, the sort of larger collective problem, we need to rethink the individual benefit aspect, because the focus has been narrowly on economic benefits in the labour market, employability and rates of pay over a lifetime if you're lucky. Mostly it's 6 months or 12 months after graduation that gets measured. And while they are significant issues, and they are motivating issues, that's only a part, and a minority part, I suspect, of the overall benefit for individuals. I've developed an argument which says that we can understand higher education as a process of self-formation. It provides resources and structures and opportunities for people to develop themselves using immersion in knowledge and professional training as their medium for self-development. And in that process, they will augment their earning power, they will augment their social position. In that sense, both the screening and the human capital theory have some truth in them, but they will also develop themselves as people in all kinds of other ways. They'll develop their confidence and their agency. They'll develop their knowledge, their experience of culture. They'll develop their friendships. They may get married, form lifelong partnerships as well. That's all quite proper and legitimate. And it seems to me that if we understand higher education broadly in the kind of Kantian sense as a process of self-formation, then we can, or Confucian sense, then I think we can take in all of those intrinsic elements that you mentioned, as well as the economic and social advance that should come out of educating people that way. And I suppose the point about the common good is to say this isn't just something like in Humboldt's time for 2% of the population, the upper middle class young men who are going to be leaders of tomorrow. This is something for everyone, and schooling's already doing it for everyone. And I guess what we're doing here is extending the argument and saying higher education, with its immersion in knowledge and more advanced levels of confidence and opportunity and training, should also be part of that universal approach.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to react to here, and I'll resist asking my questions, but open it up to the floor. And I also have some questions from our online audience. Oh, thank you. You have to turn it off and have some assistance with the microphone. Let me start with an online audience question. In times of political and economic uncertainty, how can we achieve global, regional, or national consensus to finance public higher education? Tricky. That's a big question.
Well, it's a state by state and country by country problem, isn't it? And I think that for better or worse, in a lot of ways it is for worse, while we have a global ecology and we have a global culture in some ways now as well, although there's much regional and national variation in culture, and we have to some extent a global economy, although the political economy is often nationally organised too, but politics is very national. It's nationally bordered, so that the question of how we finance higher education, like any other large-scale public activity, is in the domain of national politics and national fiscal politics in particular. And so it varies a lot. And what interests me about this problem is that you have such a range of variation in financing systems in the established education systems. I mean, you've got countries where high fees are normal, you've got countries where no fees are normal, and you've got countries where small fees are normal. You've got countries where there's an expectation that the household will, from cradle to grave, will share a substantial part of the costs, and I'm talking about East Asia, and countries like, say, not very far away, India, where there's a much greater expectation that the public
will help to pay, and countries in Europe where there's an expectation that all of this should be handled through tax and spend, basically at a financial level. It should be handled through government. People will pay, but they'll pay through their taxes, which go into the common pool of resources, which government then deploys back for services such as education. So you've got so many different approaches to financing, and yet at the same time, the systems look awfully similar. I mean, you know, we all say when we resist the imposition of more tuition fees, this will reduce access. Strangely, it often doesn't. I mean, it may create inequalities. It may create regressive effects on poor families. That's certainly true. And at the margin, it may diminish access. But on the whole, you know, what's driving access is not finance. It's the desire for education, which overcomes financial barriers. Strikingly so. So you've got, you know, a situation where, as I said, similar looking education systems, upper middle class dominates the elite universities, levels of participation are rising, mass education is getting bigger and bigger, and yet the financing is very different, which makes you wonder. But I guess the real issue is not the developed countries, which have got successful, relatively successful provision of higher ed. The real issue is the developing world. And what do you do to establish higher levels of participation in sub-Saharan Africa, where it's still really low, or Pakistan and Bangladesh, where it's similar, still in the 10% or below level? How do you get things going? What role does finance play there? And I think that the state doesn't have to and can't pay for everything in terms of expanding a high quality mass level of education very quickly. What it has to do, it seems to me, is pay for the infrastructure, or at least large parts of it, or organising the finance of it. It may be coming from donor agencies, it may be coming from private investment, but the state needs to organise successfully and partly finance at least the infrastructure, because the families cannot pay for that. Middle class families will not pay for that. They will send their kids abroad rather than pay for the infrastructure at scale. So you've got to, I guess the state's got to do that, and it's got to also train the personnel. It's got to pay for the teachers. It's got to pay for the teacher training. It's got to pay for academic development and so on, at least to some extent. Those things are going to be market failures, if, in Samuelson's sense, if the state doesn't pick up the cost of most of the cost of infrastructure and most of the cost of resource development in the form of human resources, then those things won't happen, it seems to me. But I think the difficult problem, the one we're all skirting around, is what do you do when you've got a failed state? You know, what do you do when you've got a situation where the state's incapable of developing a proper education system, funding infrastructure, funding teachers, and funding, you know, student places and scholarships? It's incapable of that. What do you do if it's too corrupt, too fragmented, too much the object of war between different factions and families and military groups to actually establish an education system? I think that the impulse or the inclination there is to say, well, all right, let's bring in the donor agencies, let's bring in the private sector, let's bring in the international players. And I suspect that that approach, which has been tried now in quite a few places without sufficient success, has got its limits, and there's no substitute in the end for a coherent, relatively uncorrupt state approach to building education and health, you know, and those basic services. In the end, we can't, you know, I guess bypass the state formation problem. Where the state is fragmented, weak and corrupt, then the first priority in building education is to build a stronger state, stronger Indigenous state that would be capable and coherent and able to build an education system. Because without that, even if you establish something from outside through international donation, it can be swept away tomorrow.
Thank you. The floor is open. The first speaker here, please. Any other hands?
I'm from Ghana. I'm with the Permanent Delegation UNESCO. And as you mentioned, many countries, especially in the less developed world, have experienced quite great expansion in higher education. But despite the numerical increases in the number of tertiary institutions and student enrollment, inequalities in access to higher education remain or have even increased. There are numbers of young people who are denied access to higher education just because of a lack of or inadequate funding or financing. And governments, especially those of these states, sub-Saharan Africa and where, are being called upon to come up with innovative ideas and programs of financing higher education. I'm sure that many countries in Africa have agencies, concerned with or responsible for organizing this kind of financing. But, and I know that these countries will benefit a lot from talking to each other and sharing experiences and best practices for what they're doing and what they're doing right, and learn from each other. But there's an organization in Africa called the Association of African Higher Education Financing Agencies, IIEP, and believe it or not, the membership is only 11, the whole of Africa. This organization was started in 2008, and today there are only 11. And I don't know why that is so. Is UNESCO doing, what is UNESCO doing to, put attention on some of these things, education financing, especially in Africa, to bring us into the conversation?
Thank you. Thank you. I will take a couple of questions. Jim, over, okay, go ahead, and then come over to Jim. While the microphone is traveling, let me share a question from the online audience member. Related to Michaela's point about the difficulty of measuring benefit, how can we assess increases of intellectual capital and enhancing creativity in a country? How can higher education institutions be compensated for that? Okay, and we'll take a third question. Yes.
Okay, I'm Jim Ackers from IIEP. When you're doing the analysis, you're showing that essentially there's a big expanded demand for higher education. There's in all countries, across all countries. And the other issue which you raised was perhaps the quality of the higher education. But I also wondered, given that you're talking about it being a public good which links to human rights and so on, have you done any analysis in terms of the curriculum of higher education? Because that is much less controllable than, for example, the curriculum of public schooling. And it seems to me that in lots of countries, particularly poorer countries, people have to select to subjects which will lead to a career. And that could lead to a big gap in terms of people with political expertise, historians, etc. Is that an issue to be considered?
Oh, yeah. Questions?
Okay, I think we'll stop at that point to give you an opportunity.
I'm not going to answer the excellent "what is UNESCO doing" question, because my UNESCO colleague will have to take that one on. But on the question of the online question about how do we measure the augmentation of intellectual capital, and Jim's question about the curriculum, not totally unrelated questions actually. I do think that that Michaela's challenge is about measuring the benefits is absolutely right, and I'm engaged in a 4-year project which is looking at how different countries approach the issue of public good and its measurement in higher education to try to get to grips with this issue a little better, because I think we do and need in the next decade and earlier, if we can do it, to devise better measures of the non-private pecuniary benefits, that is everything else. I mean, we can measure access and participation of certain social groups, for example. We can trace to some extent fairly well the relative chances of someone from a poor or rich background
getting into higher education or getting into certain kinds of institutional professional training. We can do some things, but there's a lot of things we're not doing well. And one of them is the formative educational effects. And this relates to the point about the curriculum as well as the point about measuring intellectual augmentation, intellectual capital. Now, I was one of the, I suppose, the critics of testing as a way of life in education. There's an awful lot of it. It's very popular. It's very commercially driven in some countries. And I was thinking particularly when I said that of the Philippines, where the testing industry sort of controls the school system half the time. But I actually think that that measures and tests, if they're well handled, can do a great deal of good. And they provide us with data we wouldn't otherwise have, which tells us a lot. Now, PISA, it seems to me, has been very effective in driving worldwide commitment to inclusive, good quality schooling. And it's got all of the, like research rankings do, it's got all of the countries competing to improve their performance. And PISA is such a rich test that you can't do it narrowly. You actually have to deliver on the many variables that enter into the PISA score. And they include critical thinking. They include group work. And PISA's basic orientation is a problem-solving use of knowledge rather than pure knowledge for its own sake. It's quite advanced educationally. It's a good test on the whole. And the incentives it creates, while there are some negatives, of course, with any large-scale testing system, there are negatives, are on the whole, I think, driving better, not worse, educational outcomes and better distribution of them. And the distribution factor is right at the centre of PISA's thinking. You know, it was well designed. Now, I'm not saying we can do that in higher education because it's too heterogeneous and too complex, and you haven't got those wonderful state departments standing over the institutions telling them what to do, as you have in schooling. But we can develop something. We can develop effective measures of student intellectual achievement in particular disciplines, and do that over periods of time and compare progress, look at the value add, and so on. OECD started to do that with the Hello and was unsuccessful in taking it further because it got kicked in the ankles by the UK and the US institutions who didn't want this impost thrust upon them. And because essentially OECD was working outside government and through directly to universities who didn't really want to take it on. And government might have pressured them, but government wasn't sufficiently brought into the picture, I think, in some countries at least. So Hello fell over, which is a pity. I don't think competency tests, you know, generic, reading and writing skills or problem-solving skills go deeply enough in higher ed. You have to get to the curriculum. You have to get to the real learning in higher education, which is knowledge variant and knowledge intensive. So what testing that's discipline-based will do is focus attention on the problem of the curriculum. A lot of us feel that what's happening in higher education is we're seeing some emptying out of content in some disciplines, in first degree level especially. And there's some very good Aram and Roxer stuff from the US on this, two important studies where they were of the same cohort, where they looked at how much learning was going on in terms of intellectual formation. Now, they were using just competency tests, but one of the things they found was that the amount of reading was declining, and the amount of reading this is in the United States and not in the world as a whole, but the amount of reading that students were doing in some cases was quite low and less than previous studies had found, while the curriculum had become richer in terms of things like socialisation, peer group benefits, you know, structured extracurricular activity, which used to be something students did for themselves, but is now part of the program. So all its networking and socialisation benefits are going up, and the cognitive learning is going down. That's the picture. Now, whether that's happening everywhere, I'm not sure, but I found their study at a scale, you know, sufficient to be plausible. We're worried about the UK, where a third of our students now get first-class honours, which has gone a long way up from what it used to be. Well, there might be some truth in it, but probably there's a problem there. And, you know, again, pushing the focus back to cognitive learning is really important, because the intellectual formation aspect is very central to higher ed, and knowledge is really what people immerse themselves in when they form themselves in higher education to get the full benefit from it. So we need to know that's happening, and we need to know it's getting better. And the only way we're going to get at that is by testing it.
Okay. Michaela, would you like to answer our colleague from the Ghanaian delegation?
Thank you very much. I'm not sure whether there's any involvement of UNESCO in this initiative of, African institutions, funding to higher education, honestly speaking. But I think what is important to acknowledge is that there are not so many sources of funding available, and let's say the composition that they take in different contexts is, of course, varies from one country to the other. What you can see more broadly is that there is an increase in tuition fees, and what I have seen in quite a number of countries in Africa, but also in East Asia, is that governments provide a number of fully funded student places, but then they open up to candidates who have perhaps a lower qualification, but they are fee-paying candidates, and that's a way to provide, let's say, a mixture of funding, a mixture of publicly funded places to higher education, but then also bring supplementary benefits through private applicants and participants. The other question about how to assess increases in intellectual capital, I think you have alluded to the IIEP project. That was an international project. There are a number of countries that have done this. That have tested their graduates. Brazil is a country. The other Latin American countries. So there is certainly at the national level a number of attempts to test the skills and knowledges of higher education graduates. But typically it doesn't take into account value added. So we do not know what has been added actually by higher education and what was known and by the students when they came into the system. So I think the value added is really the crucial measure, and I think I do not know any particular scheme at the national level that tackles this appropriately.
Thank you. Thank you. More questions? I think we've got one from Rita. And I certainly have a couple from online. And then we have just to highlight, sorry, I forgot her name. After that, we have somebody over here. Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's right.
Thank you, Professor Marginson, for the excellent presentation, which is always very inspiring and clear. And since I'm very interested, of course, in this issue, I would like to ask you, how do you think it would be possible actually to move from theory to practice when addressing the issue of seeing education or higher education as a common good? That means if we have to build a sort of framework in order to assess this different approach that we have to higher education, which kind of factors or indicators should be considered that are not always considered from a more classical public good approach to education, in terms of both governance of the education systems and purposes of the education system. And what something on curriculum was already raised by the preceding question, but what may be some of the meaningful indicators that would represent a true move towards a vision of higher education as a common good? Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. While the microphone is traveling, let me share the questions from our online audience. Coming from a developing economy environment, I heard the comment by the speaker that trans-border provision of education attracts more resources, but surely this only applies to does it apply to developing nations, or is it mainly a northern phenomena? And secondly, looking at the matrix that you laid out, how should quality assurance agencies in higher education operate in the civil society and commercial market quadrants? Last one.
The question would probably repeat a little bit what Professor Martin was explaining, but I think I'll go a little bit further, because looking from Latin America, I was just thinking that higher education systems also play different functions. So, for example, in Latin America, higher education institutions have played historically a very strong political role in different moments, through dictatorship and so forth. In English-speaking countries, higher education has become an export service. So, obviously, playing that function will provide different incentives in order countries, as we saw, civic participation in sub-Saharan countries, forms of progress. And playing these different functions, it creates a variance in the value system, which creates different incentives for policy making. And then it brings to question whether or not this idea, this access and provision of being elitist, massification, and universal access, if that's by design or if that's actually natural, and I would like to hear your opinion on that. And then also considering that we're in a more globalized world, and there is this added complexity that you have integration of regions and cultures. And with that, as countries work with each other now with this incentives that are becoming clearer and clearer as higher education moves to the private sector. So now you have the more vulnerable countries, recipients of donations, but also you have the donors trying to streamline their help with perhaps some sector interests and so forth. And you have a role being played in foreign affairs, so education, diplomacy, and so forth, and trade. So in Latin America, because the private sector is so strong, higher education is of extreme importance for as like a market product and interest of different countries, that own groups that actually own many of those universities in Brazil, for example. So I would like to hear your opinion on that, and whether or not UNESCO and OECD play a role in terms of setting standards to protect more vulnerable and fragile states, and also set guidelines, as it has been doing with different measures and suggestions, recommendations for policy.
Okay, thank you. Can you read that? Oh, they just got crossed out. Can you get rid of the cross-out so you could read it?
Yeah, I think okay. I can pick up some of this. Well, that was a great set of questions and really quite profound where they take us in different directions. I must respond first to Rita. I mean, this is, of course, the major question arising from my presentation. What does it mean in practice? I think what we're all good at, clearly, in this developing common good discussion is establishing what it might mean and establishing principles that might be included under that heading. And that's all very well, but it also reflects our milieu, our own social and cultural circumstances, our own biases, where, we think we've made a great achievement when people from Italy and France and Germany and the UK can all agree with each other, and maybe Americans too, But there's more to it than that in terms of establishing the framework and the principles. So I do think this is important, because I think we've got to think globally, not nationally anymore, primarily globally. And UNESCO's helped us to do that. So I think we need to take the formation of the principle process further to bring in, that really nice point that was made about the Latin American tradition and politics, for example, that sort of Habermasian public sphere sort of role of the Cordoba tradition universities. It's a very significant part of the history of the university and the present as well. I go to UNAM in Mexico, and it's that kind of university. It's absolutely central to the state and to the country. Third of the research. It's enormous. The rector is often a candidate for president. It's really central. So we need to take into account these different traditions. And I know I do this all the time everywhere, but because I came from Australia and Asia Pacific, but East Asia is as important or more important than Europe now. It's really, really big and really, really developed, and its prototypes matter. So we need to bring them into the picture pronto, seems to me. So I think we've got to have that discussion, Rita. I think we really need to broaden it, but how do we go from there?
Well, I think one of the things is that we need to establish a protocol for handling commercialisation. I mean, it's not going to go away. There are a whole lot of industries in and around education at all levels. There are ways of making money from education that don't necessarily have to involve dismantling its core project. So we need to establish a dualistic relationship with commercial sectors, because there are many different businesses and products here, whereby the core provision is established and protected, but these other activities can go on. I mean, if people want to run private tutoring, for example, they're going to do so, and they're going to run it on a business-like scale in some countries with large numbers of clients, and they're going to do that in and around the existing provision of institutional education. You know, and that's an example of how the core is where the common good lies. The other activities, it seems to me, are going to be in the sector, and we may be able to tax them and draw on them to help finance the sector. And that's the price they should pay for trying to make money from people in the sector. They should help to support the sector, which is nurturing their business condition. So I think there is we need to establish that kind of firm protocol. So the point about weak and vulnerable states then becomes important, because they need to be shored up by the establishment of this core public good, common good notion of education, which is a starting point for negotiating with commercial sectors. But, you know, absolutely, it's not going to go away. So, but to make it a question of commercialism versus pure public, traditional public approach is a disaster. You know that that's not going to end well. You know, it's not going to lead us to the promised land, is it? So, we need the double approach. So establishing standards is really important. UNESCO, the international bodies have a role here, yes. On the question of HE's political role, I didn't talk about that, but it's in the back of my mind because I started in student politics like so many of us did, you know, and I know how important that aspect will continue to be. The potential of universities in particular, often the middle class predominantly, you know, an alternate or critical or counter-hegemonic leadership in the society at best, at worst, just having fun. But, you know, are important critical voices sometimes, but not always. Now, in the UK, we've turned it into a market. We have student satisfaction surveys instead of surveys of student conditions and welfare. You know, we have market research, and we allocate resources now on the basis of the results of market research, but the students can still go out in the streets at particular times and raise issues for the whole society to consider, as they do elsewhere in the world at times. And that will, I mean, you think of the role that students played in the 1960s in the United States, in the civil rights movement, and elsewhere in the anti-Vietnam movement, in the second wave of feminism, in the early ecological movement of the early 70s. You know, students were so important in the United States at that time. So this kind of thing will happen from time to time everywhere. That's part of what we do by creating a realm of freedom, relative freedom, where people are developing themselves. Sometimes they develop themselves together and they do it collectively, and they bring social improvement forward to the whole society. Sometimes they're not right, and sometimes they have to learn, but you know, that's part of the process too. So I think that's always there, that potential. And that's a good thing, but you can't legislate for it. That's in quadrant one. That's in non-state, non-market, you know, domain, and we should protect that domain because it can produce that kind of creativity from time to time. So on the online question, I'm not quite sure where the question's going, but I think online is going to be kind of important, but not a substitute for institution-based education. I think we know that now. And there'll be more and more online prototypes, more and more use of online within mainstream programs, and more use of online as an alternative program. And it'll be useful for people who can't, especially outside the big cities, which is where higher education is, in the larger cities. It'll be increasingly important, you know, in the rural areas and in the small towns. But, you know, there are things about you can't form yourself with a screen in front of you in the same way you can in a classroom or with other people, or with teaching that you see, teaching and learning that's based on corporeal and organic relationships. So it doesn't, and that's one of the reasons why online degrees don't have the same cred in the labour market, because no one feels that they're as good in that sense. But there's an awful lot of knowledge you can learn online. It's a very useful mechanism. So, I mean, I think that in the end, sometimes you can advance provision through online. You take, in the developing country context, you do online first and then you do other things. It helps establish the networks. It helps to establish the demand for education. It helps establish some of the training and some of the knowledge and some of the content that you need. And but it's not, in the end, enough on its own.
Thank you.
Well, there was a final question.
Yes.
Yeah. About quality assurance.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, there was a question on how should QA agencies operate in civil society and commercial markets? And that's, of course, a very interesting question. It is related to the issue of regulation that you have mentioned and the importance of regulating private providers. And I think actually when we see how quality assurance agencies operate at this point in time, can really see over the years that there has been a shift actually from the regulation of private providers to regulation of the higher education system as a whole, and putting the public and private provider on the same footing in terms of quality principles and processes that we would like to see, and good practices that we would like to see in higher education. So I think in a way, if we have a good quality assurance system, and if we use this to make sure that we have those public benefits that we are looking for in higher education, and we do it both for public and private providers, I think then we have definitely one of the mechanisms, perhaps one of the levers to move to a higher education system, whatever the funding is, but that contributes to desirable benefits that we are looking for.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end. Would you join me in thanking our speaker, Simon Marginson, and Michaela Martin?
Thank you, Suzanne.
I apologize for my 2 coughing fits, but I would like to thank the interpreters for their great service this afternoon, and the comms team at the table. Please join us for the 3rd strategic debate in our series on 19 April. We will look at the secrets behind the success of the world's education superpowers. It sounds very, very, very large, but in fact, Lucy Crean, our speaker, is going to take us into classrooms, talking about her recent book, Cleverlands. Lucy Crean is from the Education Development Trust. So please join us on the 19th of April. In the meantime, please join us upstairs in the very short term, just upstairs where we have a cocktail prepared, and you have an opportunity to have more informal exchange with the speaker and the discussant. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.